Okay, let's get rolling here. So archaeological studies show that diasporic Japanese communities consumed a range of Japanese and Western alcoholic beverages, but historical accounts tend to emphasize sake consumption to the virtual exclusion of other recreational beverages. And so my goal here is to kind of explore this apparent contrast with reference to scholarship on things like memory, oral history, and collective identification. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I had a mouse malfunction there. Okay. So globally speaking, research on alcohol consumption has long been heavily influenced by temperance rhetoric, with many, many studies emphasizing the negative impacts of alcohol on society and casting it as a social ill. However, a growing number of studies in anthropology, history, and related disciplines have shown that patterns of alcohol consumption also serve constructive functions in society. Things like facilitating social interaction, defining periods of leisure, providing escape from social pressures, creating and reinforcing group identities, and marking social boundaries, including those based on things like ethnicity, class, and gender. And archaeologists have made a substantial contribution to this literature, showing how ethnic minorities used imported beverages and drinking customs from their homeland to celebrate their heritage and maintain distinct identities abroad, and how, for example, colonized peoples embraced beverages of the colonizer but modified their use to fit traditional drinking patterns. And so, for example, a number of archaeological studies have revealed how early Chinese immigrants in the West consumed both Chinese and Western style beverages, revealing patterns of cultural persistence and change and efforts to retain and adapt important social and ritual traditions. Now, my research for the last 15 years or so is focused on the Ewen Cannery, an industrial salmon canning operation near Vancouver, BC, that ran from 1885 until 1930 and employed a multi-ethnic labor force, including Chinese and Japanese fishermen and cannery workers. And it was located on two small islands, Dawn and Lion Islands, with the industrial complex and the Chinese bunkhouse on Lion Island and the main Japanese fishing settlement on adjacent Dawn Island. Excavations at the Japanese settlement uncovered remains of at least 166 beverage bottles, originally containing Western beer, liquor, wine, and soda, as well as Japanese sake, beer, and soda. Now, Western liquor and beer are by far the most abundant archaeologically, comprising about 64% of the identified vessels, with other beverages far less common, including Japanese sake at about 7%, Japanese beer at 6%, and Japanese soda at 0.6%. Also found in the assemblage were fragments of at least 7 Japanese porcelain sake cups, 3 stoneware sake bottles, and 5 Chinese stoneware liquor bottles. Now, although sake has a relatively modest archaeological visibility in the Dawn Island assemblage, historical evidence suggests it was produced and consumed pretty regularly within the community. Written histories of the island settlement reveal that community members brewed sake for consumption and for sale to local Japanese and Euro-Canadians, and that late night sake drinking parties were a common way to celebrate visitors to the island. Furthermore, a brewer and a cooper were among the early settlers at the settlement, brought from Japan to produce and barrel things like sake, soy sauce, and miso. A Ewen Cannery ledger from 1905 records a cash advance to one of the community members for delivering sake to the cannery store. In 1911, the sake brewery was raided by local police after an alleged complaint by an anonymous informer. In contrast to the archaeological data, sake is really the only alcoholic beverage mentioned in historical accounts of the Dawn Island community. And its prevalence in these sources suggests it's underrepresented in the archaeological record. Now, Western style alcohol, along with Japanese beer and sake, have been reported from other pre-World War II Japanese sites in the Western US, Canada, Australia, and the Pacific. For example, Parasso et al. In 2013 reported finding fragments of glass beer and wine bottles and ceramic sake cups and decanters at a pre-World War II rural Japanese household and truck farm near Portland, Oregon. But in most cases, these pre-war reports have pretty small sample sizes, which is difficult to do any kind of, quantitative analysis of this kind of thing. Japanese and Western style alcohol bottles have also been recovered from World War II Japanese incarceration centers in the US, despite camp-wide prohibitions. For example, Slaughter identified remains of 20 glass sake jugs at Camp Amache in Colorado, plus remains of 2 porcelain sake decanters and 1 sake cup. Western style alcohol bottles were also identified in the incarcerated housing area at Amache. Now, alcohol may have been acquired through various means, including smuggling and home brewing. And interviews with former incarcerees revealed that sake was the preferred alcoholic beverage, but was consumed infrequently and limited to special occasions or as a courtesy for visitors. So based on archaeological data, diasporic Japanese communities consumed a range of Western, Japanese, and Chinese alcoholic beverages, whereas historical accounts from Dawn Island and Camp Amache emphasize sake pretty much exclusively. And this discrepancy is pretty curious. And so I decided to delve a bit deeper into firsthand accounts to interrogate this apparent pattern and seek possible explanations. Now, collection of firsthand accounts of the Issei or immigrant generation began in earnest in the 1960s. And among them is Kazuo Ito's massive 1973 compilation of accounts gathered from Issei across the Northwestern US and Canada. And another major source is the Densho Digital Repository, with Densho being a nonprofit organization established in the mid-90s to document the lives of Japanese Americans for posterity. And so I mined these sources plus whatever other first-hand accounts I could find for data on Japanese immigrant alcohol production and consumption in North America. And I came up with this slightly unwieldy table. Now, accounts relating to alcohol summarized in this table comprise memories of first and second generation and at least 1/3 generation Japanese American or Canadian. And most entries, it turns out, relate to rural or small town agricultural industrial settings. And most of the respondents, 21 of the 27, are men. Now, this may reflect the marked sex imbalance in the immigrant population, or biases in recording or sampling of these firsthand accounts, or other reasons, which should become apparent in a few minutes here. Now, aside from gender, the most obvious pattern is the disproportionate representation of Japanese over Western style alcoholic beverages, with sake and/or shochu, which is a distilled Japanese spirit, mentioned in 21 of the 27 respondents, and Western style beer, wine, or liquor mentioned by only 9. And in fact, in only 6 instances were Western style beverages mentioned apart from any discussion of sake. Alcohol is discussed in conjunction with prohibition 8 times in these accounts and New Year's celebrations 6 times. Most accounts highlight positive social and economic aspects of alcohol production and consumption, but 6 of them do mention problems associated with overconsumption, including things like depleted savings, family and social strife, traffic accidents, and health problems. According to this relatively small sample, admittedly, Japanese women were sometimes involved in the production and consumption of sake, but men were the principal producers and consumers of alcohol. Of 21 instances where men are reported as consuming alcohol, only 1 mentions a man regularly drinking alone, and he is also reported as drinking socially. Virtually all other accounts situate men's drinking in a social context, things like work camps, bars, visits with peers, and New Year's celebrations. In the 4 cases amongst these accounts where women or families consumed alcohol, 3 were during New Year and the other at a wedding. In no cases amongst the accounts I found were women reported as drinking alone or with one another. 16 respondents mentioned production of sake, suggesting homebrewing was relatively common. Some was for sale to Japanese or other customers in the community, but much was for personal consumption, often with friends or on special occasions. So according to these accounts, alcohol, mostly sake, was produced and consumed primarily by men in social celebratory context and is remembered mostly in a positive light, though there's definitely some variability here. But what to make of this emphasis on sake in contrast to what the archaeological evidence seems to say? Here I turn to literature on oral history and memory. Oral history and memory have garnered much attention in historical archaeology and the broader social sciences. And beginning in the late 1970s, oral historians began acknowledging memory as partial and selective, something that's actively constructed in the present and varying according to things like the passage of time, the identities and perceptions of the speaker and audience, and influences from society at large, including collective community memory. Scholars have recognized these characteristics of memory not as a weakness, but absolutely an opportunity to better understand how individuals and communities make sense of their lives and create meanings and identities from past events. To understand the role of sake in creating such meanings and identities, we need to start by understanding a little bit about the history of sake. Now, until the mid-20th century, sake, fermented from rice and containing between 14 and 16% alcohol, was the principal alcoholic beverage in Japan. And despite the emergence of large urban sake brewing firms beginning in the Tokugawa period, small-scale rural production and home brewing remained pretty widespread. Sake consumption long occurred primarily during formal parties and ceremonial gatherings and was not common in everyday life until it became a commercial commodity, in like the 18th and early 19th century. However, daily consumption of sake remained uncommon until the late 19th or early 20th century, and was primarily undertaken in things like ceremonial and celebratory events, including things like New Year, Shinto rituals, harvest festivals, weddings, funerals, birthdays, banquets, and house building ceremonies. Sake also played a central role in negotiating business deals, labor contracts, and community affairs, as well as quarrels amongst adult men. An understanding of oral history and Japanese history and culture help explain, at least in part, why sake consumption is emphasized in firsthand accounts, despite archaeological evidence that Japanese migrants consumed a range of alcoholic beverages. As discussed, oral accounts and memory in general tend to be partial, selective, and consciously created, and tend to vary in response to individual choices and influences from collective memory and broader cultural contexts. Individuals and groups make use of the past in making sense of their lives, maintaining social unity, and shaping their individual and collective identities in the present. Oral history research shows that because of memory's role in maintaining social cohesion, common memories will often persist at the expense of less common ones, and events considered significant at the time they're experienced tend to be more enduring. This selectiveness of oral history and its significant role in maintaining social cohesion and collective identities, both then and now, means that activities like the social and ritual consumption of sake, deeply embedded in Japanese culture, would naturally be emphasized over other beverages. Furthermore, many of the circumstances in which sake was consumed would have been recognized as significant at the time and would linger longer in memory than routine daily beverage consumption. In Japan, sake had a strong traditional role in Japanese society that included ritualized drinking, mainly by men, as a way of strengthening group identities and social bonds. its significance persisted overseas, with sake the most frequently mentioned alcoholic beverage in oral histories, and with men as the principal producers and consumers, and an overwhelming emphasis on positive memories of drinking in social contexts that reaffirmed bonds of community and culture. And so this is why I think sake is mentioned far more often than other alcoholic beverages, typically in social contexts among adult men, and often linked to traditional Japanese rituals and celebrations, even though archaeological evidence from Dawn Island and elsewhere show that many Issei consumed Western-style alcohol, often regularly. In the end, both archival and archaeological sources have distinct biases inherent in them. Historical accounts overestimate sake consumption relative to other beverages because of its elevated social and cultural significance, whereas archaeological data appear to underestimate it because things like home brewing, barreling, and bottle reuse reduce its archaeological visibility quite substantially. Now, of course, all of this is a bit of an oversimplification of a complex topic, and I hope to delve deeper into this and provide additional nuance of on the role of alcohol among Asian migrant communities, especially the significance of non-Asian beverages that are so prevalent archaeologically. And that's what I got. Thank you.